The sterile hum of the cardiac monitor was the only sound in Ward 4 until the heavy steel doors breached with a deafening crack. 5 heavily armed mercenaries poured in, expecting to slaughter helpless casualties. They didn't know the quiet, unassuming rookie nurse changing bandages was a Tier 1 lethal weapon. The forward operating medical facility at the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center 29 Palms, nestled deep in a remote stretch of the Mojave Desert in California, smelled perpetually of iodine, hot dust, and stale coffee. It was a place where shattered bodies were patched up just enough to survive the long flight back east. For Lieutenant Rachel Simmons, it was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to heal others, and in doing so, perhaps heal herself. Rachel was the newest addition to the night shift, a fresh-faced Navy Nurse Corps officer who moved with a quiet, almost timid demeanor. She wore her scrubs a size too large, burying an athletic frame, and kept her blonde hair tied back in a messy, unassuming bun. To the combat-hardened patients in Ward 4, she was just the rookie. "Easy with that tape, LT," Corporal Tyler Brooks grumbled, wincing as Rachel adjusted the dressing on his shredded calf. Brooks, a young Marine from Texas, had survived a secondary IED blast days prior. He was alive, but his patience was dead. "Sorry, Corporal," Rachel said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She loosened the medical tape with practiced, deliberate slowness, just ensuring the sterile field is maintained. From the adjacent cot, Sergeant Ryan Carter chuckled. Carter was missing his left arm from the elbow down, courtesy of a mortar shell, but the heavy doses of morphine kept him in high spirits. "Give her a break, Brooks. She's probably fresh out of a cushy stateside hospital. Ain't used to working on ugly, ungrateful grunts like you." Rachel offered a polite, nervous smile, dropping her eyes to the clipboard in her hands. "I just want to make sure you're comfortable, Sergeant." "We're Marines, LT," muttered Private First Class Dylan Murphy from the corner bed, his face wrapped in gauze. "We don't do comfortable." They liked to tease her. In their eyes, Rachel was soft. She didn't bark orders like the veteran trauma surgeons, and she visibly flinched when the distant thump of artillery echoed across the desert. Whenever a medevac chopper roared overhead, shaking the corrugated tin roof of the hospital, she would freeze, her eyes darting to the ceiling. The Marines thought she was terrified of the war zone. They had no idea that her flinch wasn't born of fear, but of deeply ingrained muscle memory. The instinct of an operator calculating rotor wash, infiltration vectors, and landing zone security. Before she was a nurse, Rachel Simmons was a phantom. She was one of the first women to quietly pass the grueling trials of BUD/S and be attached to a classified Naval Special Warfare Development Group. For years, she existed only in redacted files, conducting high-stakes direct action raids in the darkest corners of the globe. But a compromised mission overseas had left 2 of her teammates dead in her arms. The blood on her hands had become too heavy. She turned in her trident, went to nursing school under a modified identity, and sought redemption in saving lives rather than taking them. But war has a funny way of finding the people who try to leave it behind. The mundane rhythm of the ward was shattered late that night. The heavy double doors of the trauma bay swung open, and the atmosphere in the hospital instantly shifted. A team of heavily armed, ununiformed men, CIA paramilitary, Rachel's trained eye noted instantly, wheeled in a stretcher. On the stretcher was a man thrashing wildly against leather restraints, bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to the chest. He wasn't American. He was older, with a thick beard and eyes wide with panic. Dr. Michael Grant, the chief medical officer, rushed out of his office, his face pale. "What is the meaning of this? You can't bring a hostile into a recovery ward." "He's not a hostile anymore, Doc. He's our only ticket to finding a stolen shipment of VX nerve gas," snapped a man in a black polo shirt, flashing a badge that nobody bothered to read. "His name is Kareem Hassan. He's a high-value asset. You keep him breathing until our extraction bird gets here, or a lot of innocent people are going to die." Rachel stood by the nurse's station, organizing vials of saline, but her eyes tracked everything. She noticed the way the CIA operatives positioned themselves at the exits. She noticed the lack of heavy weaponry. They had sidearms and concealed submachine guns, meaning they were traveling light and fast. And she noticed the terrified look in Kareem's eyes. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was bait. They moved Kareem into room 4B, an isolation room at the far end of the hall, directly across from the Marines. 2 operatives planted themselves outside the door. "Looks like we got ourselves a VIP," Brooks whispered from his cot, trying to crane his neck to see. "Keep your head down, Brooks," Carter said, his voice losing its earlier humor. "Spooks rolling in at night with a bleeding asset? That puts a massive target on this whole facility." Rachel walked over, her face a mask of mild, nurse-like concern. "Try to get some sleep, Marines. They'll be gone by morning." She walked away, but her pulse had slowed to a steady rhythmic crawl. The familiar, icy calm she hadn't felt since she left was beginning to seep back into her veins. The hospital had settled into an uneasy silence. Outside, a freak desert storm had rolled in, battering the reinforced walls of the compound with violent gusts of wind and heavy rain. The rhythmic drumming of water against metal provided a deceptive lullaby. Rachel was sitting at the nurse's station, charting patient vitals under the glow of a small desk lamp. Dr. Grant was asleep in the break room. The two CIA operatives were leaning against the wall outside Kareem's room, drinking terrible coffee from styrofoam cups. Then the lights went out. The hum of the cardiac monitors died, replaced instantly by the piercing high-pitched shrieks of battery backup alarms. The entire ward plunged into pitch darkness for 5 agonizing seconds before the emergency red lighting kicked in, bathing the corridor in a sinister, bloody glow. "Generators should be kicking over," one of the CIA men muttered, drawing his Glock. "Comms are dead," the other operative said, tapping his earpiece. "I'm getting zero signal, not even static. We're being jammed." At her desk, Rachel didn't gasp. She didn't panic. Her hand smoothly reached down to her pocket and retrieved a heavy pair of stainless steel trauma shears. The rookie nurse persona evaporated into the shadows. Her posture shifted from slouched and submissive to coiled and predatory. Power grid failure coinciding with a localized frequency jammer. That wasn't a storm. That was a synchronized Tier 1 breach tactic. "Stay in your beds," Rachel ordered the Marines, her voice suddenly devoid of its usual soft tremor. It was sharp, authoritative, and carried the undeniable weight of command. Brooks and Carter exchanged a confused look in the red light. Thwip! Thwip! The distinctive muffled cough of suppressed weaponry echoed from the main entrance of the hospital, followed by the heavy thud of bodies hitting the linoleum floor. The perimeter guards were down. The two CIA operatives outside Kareem's room raised their weapons, aiming down the long red-lit corridor. "Contact front," one shouted. A flashbang grenade rolled around the corner, clinking innocently against the floor tiles. "Cover!" Rachel yelled, diving behind the reinforced concrete pillar of the nurse's station just as the grenade detonated. A blinding white flash and a concussive roar ripped through the ward, shattering the remaining glass in the observation windows. Before the ringing in their ears could stop, 4 men in black tactical gear and panoramic night vision goggles swept into the hallway. They moved with terrifying, practiced fluidity. A perfectly executed fatal funnel stack. They were professionals, likely a highly paid private military contractor unit hired by whoever Kareem had betrayed. The CIA operatives fired blindly into the smoke, but they were hopelessly outgunned. Short, controlled bursts from suppressed MP7 submachine guns cut them down in seconds. Both men fell, their blood pooling dark and slick under the emergency lights. In the Marines' ward, panic set in. Brooks, unable to walk, frantically grabbed a heavy metal IV pole, his knuckles white. Carter, with his one good arm, tried to drag himself out of bed to find cover. They were sitting ducks. "They're going to clear the rooms," Carter hissed, sweat pouring down his face. "Brooks, if they come through that door, you swing that thing for the fences." A heavy combat boot kicked open the door to Ward 4. A lone mercenary stepped in, his weapon raised, sweeping the room. He saw the wounded Marines and sneered behind his balaclava, slowly raising the barrel of his rifle toward Brooks. He never saw the nurse. Rachel dropped from the drop-ceiling tiles above the doorway like a striking viper. She had scaled the wall shelving in the moments after the flashbang. Landing squarely on the mercenary's shoulders, she locked her legs around his neck in a flawless triangle choke, shifting her weight violently to drag him backward. As the massive man stumbled, flailing wildly to throw her off, Rachel drove the blunt, heavy tip of her steel trauma shears directly into the brachial artery beneath his collarbone, bypassing his Kevlar plate carrier entirely. The man let out a wet, gargling gasp, his finger jerking away from the trigger. Rachel didn't stop. With terrifying efficiency, she wrapped a heavy-duty medical tourniquet around his throat, planting her knee into his spine and wrenching the strap tight. In mere seconds, the mercenary went completely limp. She eased his body to the floor without making a single sound. Brooks and Carter sat frozen in their hospital beds, their mouths hanging wide open. The metal IV pole slipped from Brooks's trembling hand, clattering loudly against the bed frame. The quiet, timid rookie nurse, who was afraid of needles, had just executed a brutal, silent takedown that belonged in a Special Forces textbook. Rachel stood up, her scrub stained with the mercenaries' blood. Her eyes, previously warm and nervous, were now cold, calculating, and dead empty. She seamlessly stripped the dead man of his MP7, extra magazines, and a combat knife, checking the weapon's chamber with a rapid, fluid motion. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and picked up the dead man's sidearm. "Lieutenant," Brooks whispered, his voice cracking with shock. "What the hell are you?" Rachel didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the hallway, tracking the shadows of the remaining mercenaries moving toward Kareem's room. "I'm your nurse, Corporal," Rachel said smoothly, clicking the safety off her weapon. "And right now, it's my job to make sure you boys stay alive." The hallway of the medical compound was bathed in the harsh, rotating crimson of the emergency backup lights. The smell of copper, ozone, and burnt cordite hung heavy in the air, masking the usual scent of sterile iodine. Rachel pressed her back against the cool cinder block wall, just outside Ward 4. Inside the ward, Corporal Brooks and Sergeant Carter sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide in the dark. The rookie was gone. In her place was a phantom, an apex predator moving with a terrifying, silent grace that made a mockery of their earlier teasing. Rachel closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, tuning out the shrieking medical alarms and the violent drumming of the desert storm against the roof. She isolated the sounds that mattered. One set of heavy boots moving left toward the break room, two sets of boots holding static near the end of the hall outside Kareem's isolation room. A radio crackling. They were disciplined. They weren't rushing. They were clearing the sectors. The mercenary heading for the break room was the immediate liability. If he found Dr. Grant, he'd have a hostage, and the entire tactical geometry of the hospital would collapse. Rachel moved. She didn't run. She glided. Her soft-soled nursing clogs, usually a source of comfort for long shifts, now served as the perfect stealth footwear on the polished linoleum. She reached the threshold of the break room just as the mercenary kicked the door open. Inside, Dr. Grant let out a muffled yelp, diving behind a plastic folding table. "Rachel!" the mercenary barked, sweeping the room with his rifle's laser sight. Rachel didn't give him a second to process the cowering doctor. She stepped into the doorway, her footwork perfectly balanced, and brought the MP7 up. She didn't fire. The noise, even suppressed, would alert the two men down the hall. Instead, she closed the distance in two lightning-fast strides. As the mercenary spun toward the movement, Rachel ducked under the barrel of his rifle. She drove the palm of her left hand upward, smashing the base of his chin and snapping his head back with a sickening crunch. Before he could fall, she pivoted, wrapping her arm around his neck and driving the pommel of her stolen combat knife into the nerve cluster behind his ear. The man went out like a light, collapsing into Rachel's arms. She lowered him silently to the floor, panting softly. Dr. Grant peeked over the edge of the folding table, his face devoid of color. He looked at the dead mercenary, then up at his newest, quietest nurse, who was currently wiping a smear of blood off her cheek with the back of a surgical gloved hand. "Lieutenant Simmons," Dr. Grant whispered, his voice trembling so hard it cracked. What is happening?" "Lock this door, Doctor," Rachel whispered back, her voice devoid of emotion, operating on pure cold adrenaline. "Stack the chairs against it. Do not open it for anyone unless they speak the day's countersign. Do you remember it?" No, I'm a surgeon, not a soldier." "The countersign is rainfall," Rachel said firmly, locking eyes with him to anchor his panic. "If they don't say it, you hide. Understand?" Grant nodded frantically. Rachel slipped back out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind her. Down the corridor, the radio clipped to her stolen tactical vest crackled to life. It was the mercenary leader. "Bravo 2, status on the perimeter. Bravo 3, secure the dock. We're breaching the target room now." Rachel unclipped the radio, pressing the transmit button. She didn't speak. She just keyed the mic twice. Click, click, silence echoed on the other end of the frequency. The leader was a professional. He knew instantly what 2 clicks meant. It meant his man was down and their communications were compromised. "Contact in the corridor," the leader's voice hissed over the radio, the false calm breaking slightly. "Bravo 4, watch our 6. We're blowing the door to 4B." Rachel knew she had mere moments before Kareem was dead or extracted. She couldn't take them both in a straight firefight down a long, open hallway. She had no body armor, just thin cotton scrubs. She needed to change the environment. She backed into the main supply closet. Her eyes scanned the shelves, calculating, adapting. She grabbed 2 large heavy cylinders of compressed medical oxygen. She rolled them out into the hallway, laying them flat on the linoleum. With a sharp twist, she snapped the regulator valves off both tanks. High-pressure oxygen began violently hissing into the confined corridor, creating a blinding, chaotic plume of white vapor. "Movement in the smoke!" yelled Bravo 4, the mercenary guarding the intersection. He raised his rifle, firing a blind 3-round burst into the vapor cloud. The bullets sparked against the linoleum. That was all Rachel needed. The distraction was set. While Bravo 4 was focused on the hissing tanks in the center of the hall, Rachel had already slipped into the adjacent empty patient room. She moved to the drywall partition separating the rooms. Hospitals and forward operating bases were built cheap and fast. She raised her boot and delivered a devastating piston-like mule kick to the drywall. The cheap plaster shattered. Rachel stepped through the hole, bypassing the hallway entirely, and emerged directly behind Bravo 4. He spun around at the noise of the breaking wall, his eyes wide behind his night vision goggles. But Rachel was already inside his guard. She brought the MP7 up in a tight center-axis relock stance and squeezed the trigger. Thwip, thwip, thwip. 3 suppressed rounds caught the mercenary center mass, driving him backward into the wall. He slid to the floor, leaving a thick smear of crimson on the white paint. 1 left. A deafening explosion rocked the corridor. The mercenary leader had placed a breaching charge on Kareem's reinforced isolation door. The steel door blew off its hinges, crashing into the room with a cloud of thick, choking dust. Rachel stepped over Bravo 4's body, her weapon raised, and moved into the smoke. Inside room 4B, Kareem Hassan was screaming. The captured asset was still strapped to his hospital bed, thrashing wildly against the leather restraints as the mercenary leader, a massive man clad in heavy tactical armor, stepped through the ruined doorway. The leader, call-sign Vance, didn't waste time. He grabbed Kareem by the collar of his hospital gown, pressing the barrel of a heavy .45 caliber pistol to the terrified man's temple. "Where is the shipping manifest?" Vance roared over the howling wind outside. "Give me the coordinates of the VX or I'll scatter your brains across this monitor." "Drop it," Vance froze. The voice behind him wasn't the deep, aggressive bark of a Marine guard. It was calm, steady, and terrifyingly cold. It was the voice of a woman. Vance slowly turned his head. Standing in the doorway, framed by the red emergency lights and the swirling oxygen vapor of the hallway, was a blonde woman in blood-soaked nursing scrubs. She had an MP7 leveled perfectly at the gap between his helmet and his ballistic collar. For a second, Vance's brain short-circuited. He looked at her oversized scrubs, the messy bun, the hospital ID badge clipped to her pocket. Then he looked at her eyes. They were the eyes of an apex predator. They were the eyes of a Tier 1 operator. "Who the hell are you?" Vance sneered, tightening his grip on Kareem. "You're no nurse." "I'm the night shift," Rachel said softly, "and visiting hours are over. Let him go." Vance laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He pulled Kareem up, using the bound man as a human shield. "You shoot me, you shoot the asset. You think I don't know the rules of engagement, sweetheart? Drop the weapon, or I put a bullet in his head, and then I take my time with you." Rachel didn't blink. She didn't negotiate. Her SEAL training had taught her that hesitation got hostages killed. She analyzed the target. Vance was heavily armored. His chest, back, and head were protected. But in pulling Kareem up, he had exposed his right shoulder, the arm holding the pistol. Rachel exhaled, letting her breath out in a slow, controlled hiss. She squeezed the trigger. She didn't aim for Vance. She aimed for Kareem. The suppressed MP7 coughed a single round. The bullet struck Kareem perfectly in the fleshy, non-lethal outer deltoid of his left shoulder. It punched clean through the muscle, through and through, and buried itself directly into Vance's exposed bicep behind him. Kareem screamed in pain, but Vance roared in agony. The heavy .45 caliber pistol slipped from Vance's suddenly useless fingers, clattering to the floor. Before Vance could recover, Rachel dropped the empty MP7 and sprinted across the room. Vance, enraged and operating on adrenaline, swung his massive left arm in a wild backhand, catching Rachel in the ribs. The impact was like getting hit by a truck. Rachel was thrown backward, crashing violently into a rolling medical cart. Vials of medicine, syringes, and a heavy metal defibrillator crashed down around her. Pain flared in her side, definitely a cracked rib. Vance drew a heavy combat knife with his left hand, stepping over Kareem's bed, his eyes wild with fury. "I'm going to carve you up." Rachel scrambled to her feet, her breathing ragged. She didn't reach for her own knife. Instead, her hands grabbed the heavy red paddles of the defibrillator that had fallen off the cart. Vance lunged, driving the knife toward her chest. Rachel sidestepped the brutal thrust with inches to spare. She slammed her foot down on the defibrillator's base unit, hitting the manual override charge. The machine whined instantly. With Vance off balance from his missed stab, Rachel lunged forward. She slammed both heavy metal paddles directly onto the exposed skin of Vance's neck, right over his carotid arteries. Clear. 200 joules of electricity arced through the mercenary leader's nervous system. Vance's body went completely rigid. His eyes rolled back into his head, his muscles locking in a violent, uncontrollable spasm. The knife dropped from his hand. Rachel held the paddles down for a few agonizing seconds until the machine beeped, resetting. Vance collapsed backward like a felled redwood, hitting the linoleum with a heavy final thud. He didn't move. Rachel stood over him, dropping the paddles. The room was silent except for Kareem's whimpering and the pounding rain outside. She pressed 2 fingers to Vance's neck. A pulse, but faint. He was out cold. She turned to Kareem, who was staring at her as if she were a demon. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a sterile gauze pad, and slapped it over the bullet hole in his shoulder. "Keep pressure on that," she ordered, her tone shifting seamlessly back to a clinical professional register. Suddenly, the hospital was flooded with blinding white light. The generators had finally been fully repaired. The deafening thwack, thwack, thwack of Apache helicopters shook the roof. The quick reaction force had arrived. Within minutes, the corridors were flooded with heavily armed Marines in full combat gear. They swept the hospital, weapons raised, shouting clear codes. A squad of Marines burst into Ward 4, sweeping their rifles across the room. They froze at the sight before them. The heavy steel doors were blown out. The walls were riddled with bullets. 3 dead mercenaries lay in pools of blood in the hallway. And sitting calmly in the center of the ward was Lieutenant Rachel Simmons. She was holding a roll of medical tape, gently resecuring the IV line into Corporal Brooks's arm. Her scrubs were torn and soaked in blood. A nasty bruise was already forming on her cheekbone, and she was favoring her left side. But her hands were perfectly steady. A heavily armed Marine captain lowered his rifle, staring at the carnage in the hallway, then looking at the quiet, unassuming blonde nurse. "Lieutenant," the captain breathed, utterly bewildered. What happened here? Where is the enemy?" Rachel finished taping the IV, giving it a gentle pat. She stood up, smoothing down her ruined scrubs, and offered the captain a polite, nervous smile. "They had a little accident, Captain," Rachel said softly, her voice carrying that familiar, timid tremor. She looked down at Brooks, who was staring at her with a mixture of absolute terror and profound reverence. "Isn't that right, Corporal?" Brooks swallowed hard, glancing at the dead men in the hall, then back to his nurse. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "They slipped." Carter, from his bed, managed a weak and awestruck chuckle. "Remind me never to complain about the food again, LT." An hour later, a man in a crisp suit, a senior CIA handler, walked into the ward. He surveyed the tactical destruction, the precision kills, the flawless execution of close-quarters combat. He stopped in front of Rachel, who was sitting at the nurse's station, sipping a fresh cup of coffee and icing her ribs. The suit looked at her name badge, then down at the way she held her pen, ready to strike, not to write. He recognized the ghost sitting in front of him. "Lieutenant Simmons," the suit said quietly, ensuring the Marines couldn't hear. "Or should I use your previous rank? The agency owes you a debt tonight?" Rachel took a sip of her coffee, her eyes dropping back to her patient charts. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir. I'm just a nurse." She didn't look up, but her voice carried a quiet, undeniable finality. "And my shift isn't over." The handler nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile on his face, and walked away. The phantom of Ward 4 had returned to the shadows, hidden perfectly in plain sight. Sometimes the strongest people are not the ones who speak the loudest, wear the toughest face, or demand to be noticed. Sometimes, true strength lives quietly inside someone who chooses kindness after surviving pain. Rachel's story reminds us that we should never judge a person by what we see on the surface. The timid nurse everyone underestimated was carrying a past full of sacrifice, loss, and courage. Yet she did not use her strength to prove herself. She used it to protect others. That is one of life's most valuable lessons. Real greatness is not about showing the world how powerful you are, but about standing up when others need you most. We all carry hidden battles, silent wounds, and untold stories. A gentle heart does not mean a weak spirit. In fact, those who have suffered deeply often become the ones who heal, defend, and love the hardest. So before you underestimate someone, remember that quiet people may be fighting wars you know nothing about. And before you doubt yourself, remember that your scars may become the reason you save someone else. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that remind us what courage, compassion, and humanity truly mean.